Our goal is to develop to where we understand the patterns. You have a healthy body once you understand the patterns that make a healthy body.
Right.
Until then, you're a victim of unhealthy patterns
Yep.
and not knowing what the patterns are. Same thing with your energy body. They have strong vital force. You have to understand what the principles are for feeding that, both through the food we take in, through breathing practices, exercise, a whole variety of things. The emotional body being healthy, and you actually have a life that's emotionally full and fun and joyous rather than a constant misery.
Yeah.
Mental life, knowing how to control your own mind so your mind doesn't destroy your life, but your mind becomes a superpower. All these things are based on the knowledge of pattern.
You talked about the science of patterns and you described there's a pattern behind everything. You describe how we're subject to and sometimes victim to patterns throughout our lives unless we consciously understand and create with them, which is something that, I personally believe and have studied, but I think you do a very good job of presenting it in digestible ways with good visual imagery. So, could you expand on the concept of patterns and how ultimately everything is an expression of patterns and how that is important for us to understand?
Absolutely. So, if you go to any classical ancient spiritual tradition, they understood there are different levels of structure, different levels of manifestation, from the high divine level where you're connected with the one being of all things and all beings together as a unity. And then you go down to these multiple levels, given different names and different traditions, all the way down to the physical plane. And we need to understand that the electromagnetic is actually below the physical plane. It's not life energy, it's not above the physical, it's actually below it. We'll go into that in more detail a little bit later. But the whole idea here is that there's a pattern behind everything. And so, one of the things I describe in the Gaia series is that the ancient traditions are almost all uniform in saying where all physical structure comes from is a thought form in the mind of God from that original unity field. It starts as a type of a thought form of a pure pattern. Then that pattern manifested the spiritual tradition as archetypal spiritual beings, conscious spiritual beings as real as you and I, more real in some ways, much more advanced, that are an actual crystallization into conscious beingness of certain patterns and certain powers and certain functions. And then they understood that from there, you begin to form the patterns of karma, of actual physical incarnation, of what in the West and the Theosophical Society call the causal plane. Then you come down to the forming of the structures of how we understand things conceptually at the mental plane. Then it comes down to how it forms the structures of our emotional body, which is what really drives most of our behavior. And then it comes down to that wave talked about in physics of the etheric body, the chi, ki, prana level of vital life force. And that's a pure energy structure that then gives the structure that the physical matter then condenses or crystallizes around to create the physical body. And then when those life energy forces are used up constructing the physical body, they decay below the speed of light and they become the electromagnetic spectrum. So if we understand that as the basic understanding in the ancient world for how everything works, then we can understand that it's the patterns behind everything that are absolutely key. So we have to understand as we grow up from a child to an adult and start taking care of ourselves instead of somebody else taking care of us, that process of maturation in every lifetime is a type of microcosmic playing out in a single lifetime of what happens to us as a spiritual being across multiple lifetimes. We start not knowing anything, being very ignorant, and higher spiritual beings have to guide us and teach us. And then we incarnate in a physical body. We go through a whole series of those things. So our physical lifetime tends to be a microcosmic representation of the same pattern of the multiple lifetime journey. And this happens all over the place. Today we call it fractals,
Mm-hmm.
that this particular pattern exists on all scales of development. And so I show, for example, in the Gaia series, that something like the torus pattern. If you get a sphere, which is the primary form for holding consciousness and energy together, you get a sphere, which is a holding form, and you open it up at the top and bottom so energy can flow through it, like an hourglass shape in the center,
Hmm.
and then flow around the outside and then back to the center and back around the outside, that's a torus.
Like cutting the
And
core out of an apple.
exactly. An apple is based on a torus. You see it how it's indented at the top and the bottom.
Hmm.
And then the core of it with the seeds is right in the center line, the same as our central channel in the body. Once you start to perceive these
Yes.
patterns, you see how everything is connected and it's the same basic patterns that rule everything. And so I show in the Gaia series that the torus exists from the subatomic level. We have photographs of toroidal structures subatomically up to galactic levels that have
Hmm.
toroidal structures. So this is the idea of scale invariance, that regardless of how big or small the scale is, the same pattern is the key pattern to create the energy flow. But the same thing is true for us emotionally and mentally. All of us, I think, have had the experience where we grow up and we have these tremendous yearnings, emotional yearnings. Where's our missing half? Where's the person we're going to unify with? Where's all of my romantic aspirations I was taught to have as a young child, taking in media about that perfect partner I would have that would make my life complete?
Hmm.
And we had that emotional yearning. And then through the school of hard knocks, with some relationships that maybe didn't work out well and we were very naive in, and we got knocked around, we begin to say, oh, I better figure this out. And then we begin to see patterns. I have certain patterns of behavior I didn't know that screw up my relationships. I see dysfunctional patterns in other people, and maybe I can handle that in this person, but I don't want to deal with it in this person. It's just too dysfunctional. So we start seeing those patterns at the emotional level. Same thing at the mental level. How do I put my life together? How do I divide my time in the day? What's important and not important to me? Everything has a pattern on every level. And once you begin to understand these patterns, the same thing is true on the spiritual levels. There are patterns to how spiritual beings work and operate. And this is going to be important for us because when we pass through the gate of death, if we don't have some understanding for how spirit operates and we haven't developed any organs of spiritual perception, we're as deaf, dumb, and blind spiritually as Helen Keller was in the physical world,
Right.
where she had to be guided around everywhere. And that's why you see these pictures in the old Egyptian tradition, like from the Papyrus of Ani, which we know as the Egyptian Book of the Dead, and is better called the Book of Coming Forth into Light. That in that you see Ani, who's the initiate being trained, he's like bent over, hunched over, and he's got this greater being holding his hand and guiding him through these worlds that he's not able to navigate through or understand himself yet. That's what happens to every human being. Our goal is to develop to where we understand the patterns. You have a healthy body once you understand the patterns that make a healthy body.
Right.
Until then, you're a victim of unhealthy patterns
Yep.
and not knowing what the patterns are. Same thing with your energy body. To have strong, vital force, you have to understand what the principles are for feeding that, both through the food we take in, through breathing practices, exercise, a whole variety of things. The emotional body being healthy, and you actually have a life that's emotionally full and fun and joyous rather than a constant misery.
Yeah.
Mental life, knowing how to control your own mind so your mind doesn't destroy your life, but your mind becomes a superpower. All these things are based on the knowledge of pattern.